sometimes when I look at the Pharisees in a story like this, I think that it's so disconnected from my real life or my understanding of. I know that it has something to do with the Pharisees and what they're wrestling with, but I don't have that problem, right? So what is the Pharisees' problem here? What are they really struggling with? And is there any way for me to identify if I'm dealing with the same kind of issue?
So on today's episode, right? That's what we'll talk about,
right.
Because that's basically all of it, right? So, yeah, I think there is a temptation when we read passages like this to think that, well, that was a problem in their time. And because we don't kind of culturally relate to even what they're talking about, and we don't have any, for many people reading this, might not have any historical background or know what these issues are that they're even referring to. It just feels like a squabble over some ancient, obscure, legalism stuff. And I think what would be a real tragedy, by the way, and I talked a little bit about this, and maybe we could unpack this a little bit further, but what I want to say right off the top is that what Jesus is not doing throughout this whole episode is to say, and this is I would say, beware of this, because this is a really immature take on Jesus. And a lot of pastors, I say a lot, you'll hear pastors using this, in churches and movements and so forth, which is basically to position Jesus against the law, right? So Jesus is this liberator from all the religious baggage, expectation, rules, regulations, and you will find, I promise you, there's a whole stream of people that is exactly how they see Jesus. They see him as the guy who shows up and says, all that old stuff, you don't have to do it anymore. It's not important anymore. All these people are obsessed with keeping the rules, but I'm just here to tell you about how much God loves you. And in so doing, what they do is they end up making the Testaments enemies of each other. Or you could say it like this. They end up making Jesus in the New Testament an enemy of Yahweh in the Old. That somehow the God of the Old Testament is vengeful and he's angry and he's really bothered about sin and judgment, and he's always handing down laws and rules, and I just don't like that guy very much. But Jesus, here he comes, and he's breaking all those laws and rules and just being like, it's not that big of a deal. We just need to love one another. And I'm telling you, there's a huge stream of people. Some would consider themselves Christians, but then there's even a kind of branch of this that shows up in secular sort of thought, which is, I really love Jesus. They view Jesus less as a savior, more as a teacher, but still they love the kind of teachings of Jesus because he seems to stand against the sort of religiosity that they hate. And I think even more so, they don't like, it's what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, they don't like, it's what John 3 says, that the light has come, but people love the darkness more than the light because their deeds were evil. And I think we want a Jesus who doesn't tell us what to do and isn't going to demand much of us in terms of change or behavior or morality. And so what we have is this Jesus of acceptance and grace and love and healing the sick and liberating the oppressed and all this stuff. And so we kind of read these religious leaders as like an opposite of that, these rule-keeping, quite frankly, kind of gets even borders on conservative, like you get these, these people who never have any fun and they're always upset about the rules being broken and so forth. And so, yeah, I think that happens. And what I want to say right from the beginning is that is not what's going on here. It's actually much different than that. Jesus is not here to say, I'm establishing a whole new kind of, like we're doing away with all of that But as Blake likes to say, he came to fulfill the law, which means to fill it full. In other words, he came to live it out and embody it so fully that it became complete or fully realized in him. And so all this sacrificial system, but also this whole kind of purity thing that we're going to talk about. And what we mean by that is ritual purity. And we could get into what all that means, but that he comes to be the ultimate fulfillment of that all this washing that they were doing was really a picture of what Jesus was ultimately going to do. It was meant to lead them to Christ, and they missed the point. That's the trouble. So Jesus isn't saying, let's get rid of all those old rules. He's here to fulfill what those traditions were meant to point to.
So you mentioned it just now. You talked about the hand washing thing. That's exactly what the Pharisees are kind of bringing to Jesus. Like,
right.
Why are your disciples not washing, or some of them aren't washing their hands?
Yeah, so that's part of what's called the Mishnah. So there's this oral tradition that kind of went beside the Torah, if you will. What are you thinking?
I'm just curious. Okay, so you're going to kind of unpack what the Mishnah is. I want to know, like, it's this oral tradition that went alongside the law that kind of explains how exactly you follow it, because people are
because
curious.
There's ambiguity.
Yeah.
So if we take, for instance, the command to honor the Sabbath, one that Jesus was constantly or consistently accused of breaking, yet he isn't breaking the Sabbath. That's the trouble. Mm-hmm. So if we take kind of the first immature interpretation that I'm talking about, that Jesus is sort of moving beyond these old rules and regulations, then basically what you see him doing is, Sabbath, Shmabbath. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? Who cares? I can kind of do what I want now. No, that's not what he's saying. What they were upset with Jesus for is breaking their traditions around the Sabbath, not the intent of the Sabbath itself. And so Jesus is recapturing the heart of the command. Meanwhile, they're upset that he is violating their specific, definite interpretations of the command. So the Mishnah would say, if we're not allowed to do work on the Sabbath, then what constitutes work? And there would be all these different rulings as to what work was. And I mean, I don't have them memorized, but it would be like you could, care for your animal in this way, but not in this way. There were like certain problems with your livestock that if it was like life-threatening, you could help them with. If it wasn't, you had to let it wait. And so, because that's work. You could, in case of emergency, you could help the animal, but otherwise you just had to let it be if it, and so there was a distance for how far you could walk on a Sabbath. It was so you'll find in the New Testament, it says a Sabbath day's journey from here to there. And that's because there was a distance they were allowed to walk, but then not further. So they had all these regulations that they had put in place. And it was not just for, say, Sabbath keeping, it would have been for all the different commandments. And so it's this vast kind of, you could call it legal complex of rules that said this is what you can and can't do regarding each of, here's what constitutes adultery and what doesn't. Here's what constitutes honoring your father and mother and what doesn't, and all of this. And so you were expected to kind of hold to that if you wanted to be a good law-keeping Jew. The problem was that they were missing the heart of these commandments in their kind of trying to pin the commandments down in definite terms.
Do you think that this emphasis of oral tradition and these kinds of mandates or boundaries that they put on Sabbath or when you should pray or how you should wash your hands, do you think they came from a sincere place?
That's a good question. I mean, not knowing the beginnings of the Mishnah, I mean, it's hard to say. My hunch is that it would. I mean, you're wanting to know, how do we do this specifically? Yeah. But I think there's a problem with, because I think we do this, right? I think we want to know. There are things about God or his ways or following him that that are opaque to us, that we don't maybe see in the moment or maybe ever. And in our desire to kind of pin those things down, I think what we're looking for, and I think what they're looking for, is a measure of psychological control. It's what we all do when life kind of gets chaotic. We want to define things, understand things. That's why we ask why. Because if we could understand it, then maybe we could gain some measure of control over it. I mean, and so I think when we feel like we're sort of in a place where life is unknown and there's much mystery and we don't understand what's going on, we feel powerless. But when we understand things and there's no ambiguity and everything is in black and white, it just becomes so clear that we feel like we're in control of a particular situation. And that's why people, and I think rightfully so, in many situations, ambiguity is a really tough thing. As a leader, it's a really tough thing. You're trying to lead people and you leave ambiguity. People want you to like nail it down for them. And because again, it allows you to kind of take charge of the situation. And so I think that's kind of what has arrived here is they have, I said this weekend, a faith that doesn't require any faith, where they know exactly what is required of them, and they can kind of then just go through these motions and quote unquote serve God. But it's not working.
Yeah. So how much you are talking about this idea of control, and I can't help but hear that behind that exists some kind of fear.
Yeah.
For them?
Yes.
Okay. So for them, maybe what would that fear have been potentially?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if you've ever felt this way. I remember when kind of what we call the new atheist movement sort of took off. I don't know so new atheists, if you don't know who they are, would be like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and who's the other one? Christopher Hitchens and others. And so there was kind of a boom of this in the early 2000s. They kind of started gaining a lot of popularity, and you were starting to hear deconversion stories of Christian people or evangelicals, which you're still hearing that term.
Why can't I say it?
Evangelical or whatever it is. Ex-evangelical.
Ex-evangelical. That is what
But you were hearing these kind of deconversion stories of people who used to, grew up Christian and are not anymore, and they sort of came to light, wow, I've realized there is no God and all this kind of stuff. And I remember being scared of those books. I never bought one, read one, never wanted to read or hear any of those stories because I was scared of what I would find there. I don't know if you've ever felt that way before, but it made me really nervous to think that maybe there's some airtight argument against God and my faith that it would totally blow my world up. Like everything would have to change. Well, think of the threat that Jesus poses to them. And their whole way of life has been built on this. And if they're wrong, it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
And it's humbling.
Yeah.
And it's scary and it's terrifying. I find this even within the Christian community. I'm sure you've dealt with it, where people have certain theological leanings or perspectives that, let's take the sovereignty of God, what God is in control of, what he's not in control of. There are different points of view. You could call it a spectrum. And you could be a Christian, absolutely love the Lord and be a Christian, and two different Christians might have two different points of view on this, and yet they both love the Lord. If you've grown up with sort of one point of view is the only point of view that you've ever heard, and then when someone shows up and they suggest a different way to think about that, it can be unsettling. Not just unsettling, scary. Oh my goodness, I didn't even know that was a thing, and it frightens you because it makes you wonder, are my beliefs, I don't know, can I trust them? And it freaks people out, especially people who are maybe more change averse. They get really nervous about stuff like this. And so what I think people do, if you think about it, is they sort of cling to their traditions. Think about this, like what's going on here, like a life raft, holding on to this, clinging to it for dear life, because if I let go of this, I'm lost. Do you remember?
It's a slippery slope.
Well, yeah, but you remember that scene in Finding Nemo where, what is it? It's been a while since I've seen it, but Marlin is this fish dominated by fear. He ends up losing his son. He goes on an adventure to get him back.
And before that point, he has all these like rules of how.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Of exactly how they're going to live, and they're going to live like this, and all these rules are going to keep them safe. And it ends up not working. His son ends up rebelling against him. But do you remember he's with Dory, the other fish? I can't remember what she's called. What kind of fish she is, the blue one that Ellen plays. And there's this scene where they're with this whale, and she wants to trust this whale, and he doesn't. He's like, how do you know something bad's not going to happen? And she's like, you don't, but you just have to let go. And it took everything within. He's clinging to what he has, and he has to eventually sort of let go. But in the letting go, the trouble with letting go for people who don't want to let go is that what we want is a certainty on the other end of what is going to happen, and you don't know. But that's the adventure, I would say, of life, of relationship, of following Jesus, is putting yourself in his hands. That's why I say you want a faith that doesn't require any faith. This is why I have a real problem with any sort of theological perspective that guarantees certain outcomes for certain kinds of prayer or confession, or if I pray a certain way or I use these words, then God is bound to act, and he has to. And I just think, but it's ironic to me because that's not actually faith. What trust is there in that? I know exactly what's going to happen. All I have to do is just keep praying in this specific kind of way, saying these specific kind of words, and then, of course, this outcome is going to happen. It's not to say that there's no truth to any of that whole notion. It's just to say that kind of certainty doesn't actually require faith, but to be able to say, I honestly don't know the outcome, other than to say that I know it will be good because I trust you. I mean, what would you want in a relationship? Would you want, you want someone to trust you in that way, knowing that or believing that what you're going to do will be good. That's what you want from maybe a child to you. I don't know how mom and dad's going to react. I have this problem going on. I have this thing I don't know what to do with, and I'm going to bring it to them. I can't say exactly what they're going to do, but I know they're going to do the right thing. Or do you want them to come in knowing exactly what you should do and exactly how you're going to do it and be holding you to that and accountable to that the whole time? I think we cling to that stuff because it makes us feel like we have some measure of control, and it removes, in my view, faith from faith. And it reduces God to a principle, to a formula. I literally had a guy years ago tell me, he used the phrase, my faith formula. And I was like, oh, dude, be very careful thinking about God like that. He is not a formula or a principle that you can reduce him to. He is not something that's like, if I put these inputs in, then this is the output that's going to be produced. That just makes God nothing more than a genie in a bottle. But real relationship requires there to be some mystery and some unknown and some trust. That's what relationships are.
So what would how does somebody move from that place of maybe having a sense of control or a sense of, okay, if I do X, Y, Z, everything's going to be okay, to saying, God, I want a relationship with you.
Yeah.
You're a person. And
I think you're putting yourself into his care. You literally are saying, I trust you. It doesn't mean you don't bring requests. It doesn't mean you don't ask for things. It doesn't mean when you need a miracle or you need God to show up that you don't pray and ask for those things. And it doesn't even mean that you're just kind of like, hey, whatever you want to do. But it does mean that you fervently bring your requests, but also trusting that whatever happens, it's going to be okay because I know and trust that you're good. And yeah, you're putting yourself fully into his care, which is, I think, a more dangerous, in some sense, dangerous feeling place to be, but a better place to be. It's a real place to be because I think that's how life and relationships work, rather than just demanding and holding out for a specific outcome. I'm trusting you.
Yeah. I want to talk about this from the point of people who are probably, maybe they're not kind of going to one extreme or the other, but they're somewhere in the middle. And I think I can speak to this because we all have a tendency to move back into that place, I think. No matter how much far we've come in our relationship with the Lord, there is this idea of consistently returning and repenting when we find ourselves doing that. And I think that it's because we live in this already, but not yet. We're limited, we're finite, and we're not going to get this relationship thing right all the time. And relationships require a kind of not just blanket trust, like, oh, I trust you, and I said it one time, and it's just done. But it requires a retraining of our hearts and our minds because we've been so used to doing things from a place of control for so long. And I've been following Jesus for as long as I can remember. And I still do this. I still get into that place where, God, I just have this feeling of like, I'm not doing enough. And I could even compare my life to another person's and say, but, and try to have that bring me some sort of comfort. It never does. It never does. I think I just have this feeling of like, should it be that I pray more? Should it be that I listen to another podcast or read another book? And I find that when I've gotten into that headspace, and it could be days, hours, minutes, it's like my fists are clenched. Because I'm holding on to something so tightly. This feeling of like just wanting that psychological safety, whatever you would call it. And the sooner or later, the Spirit of God in me tells me one thing, like, Casey, unclench your fists, open your hands, and actually receive grace. And work with grace. Not like Dallas Willard said, grace is opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort. And I think for this person who is maybe moving from this place of desiring control to wanting to move to trust, my encouragement, I guess, to them would be not to try to earn grace, but to rather cooperate with it, because His grace is at work on the inside of us.
So how would you how does that practically show up? You got a story or an example or a thought of how someone might do that or how you've done that?
Yeah, I would say I remember one specific time where I was on a run and I was walking up the hill back to my house after I'd run, and I was thinking about the things I needed to do because I had that feeling. And I remember my fists were literally clenched. And I heard the Spirit just tell me to open my hands. And the result was, I can't. There's just not enough that I could ever do. And I think that for a lot of people, that would be the invitation from the Lord, is to admit that you can't, and to open your hands and say, God, I need your grace. I want to follow you. I want to serve you. That is the desire of my heart, and I've been trying to do it in my own power.
Or even, Lord, I don't know.
Yeah.
The future is scary. It's unknown to me, but I trust you. Just to own that and admit that. I think some of us, it's just we're looking for certainty, and I think it happens in prophetic words. This is what's going to happen in the future. It's all a way that we can kind of soothe ourselves with certainty, so we can avoid trusting God in the unknown. And I'm not saying all of that is bad. I'm just saying, but I think the human heart, our desire is to look for specificity, certainty. One of the things I talked about this weekend is what we can measure, what we can define, what we can pin down, if you will, we can control. And I never thought about immediately the story of David taking a census in 1 Chronicles 20 came to mind. I've never made sense of that. I always read that and thought, who cares that he's taking a census? Why does God get so this is a pretty big deal. But what it dawned on me is that David is looking for, let me count my resources. Let me see what I've got. Let me, in a sense, muster my own strength. And then you can comfort yourself with that. I don't know if you ever do that. You ever look at your savings account? You ever look at like, oh man, like you're just looking for a certain measure of comfort or whatever, soothing yourself with what you've accomplished or what your record is or what you've or what you think you know for sure or whatever. You soothe yourself with those things. And I think that's what's happening here is David is looking to count his armies, his people, so that he can soothe himself with his own strength, and that it's a big no-no, and God gets pretty upset with him. But I think we're guilty of doing that sometimes.
100%.
Soothing ourselves with I think people look for this. So kind of practically speaking, a couple of things that I talked about was one, where the scripture is clear, be bold, and where it's vague, be humble. So I think what happens sometimes is we tend to seize onto parts of the Bible that are unclear and try to make them as clear as we can. So I think, again, some of this is for a certain psychological safety. It just makes us uncomfortable that there would be any kind of mystery or something that we wouldn't know. And so we want to tell you, exactly how things happened and we want to pin it all down. And one of the things I said this week is like a good example of this is we can say unequivocally, boldly, confidently, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Yes, amen, absolutely. How old is the earth? I can't tell you. How exactly did God create the heavens and the earth? What, is Genesis 1 meant to be a literal 6 days of creation, or is that figurative language? I think there's arguments to be made in both directions. but I don't have to be dogmatic about that. But man, some people are. It's like that's their thing. It has to be this way. And I guess I would just ask, why? Why are we so uptight about this? So one of the things you were at Saturday night, but one of the things I said on Sunday morning was just like, look, part of the way I know this is happening is because somebody's going to send me an email and they're going to say, well, actually, we can know how old the earth is, and here's how, and they're going to send me all their links and please read this article and listen to this podcast or whatever. And I just said, just save your email because I don't care, because I just don't think it's that important. However God did it, I just believe God did it. I can affirm that, but we look for safety in those things. And then secondly, we make universal doctrines out of personal convictions. So we take our personal convictions about things that maybe God has led us toward, spoken to us, or asked us to do or to lay down, and we want to try to apply that with a broad brush to everybody. There's only one. The King James, their whole denominations are like the King James version of the Bible is the only legitimate version of the Bible, which I just think is absolutely ridiculous. Or that women can't wear pants or whatever. And there's all these regulations. Usually, interestingly, it's usually around women. And I think it's fascinating. We want to take certain preferences. I even think, I found it interesting. It's like, I've not done a huge study on the Amish, but like, why that era? Like, why Like basically they got to a certain point in time and said, that's it. No further than this. Horses and buggies are good, but I mean, like, we can't go any further than that. And I think this is interesting. We were good with technology up to a point, and then somehow it stopped. And there's some reason for it that they've kind of bought into, and you sort of have this kind of whole community that forms up around this conviction that maybe someone had. It's interesting. We tend to do this. We tend to make applications for large groups of people around specific things that we may feel. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do. That's what's happening here.
I was looking at, we talked about this a little bit before, but I feel like it applies here. Colossians 2.
Right.
If I can find Colossians.
It's after Corinthians. You're going the wrong way.
Okay, thank you. I forgot.
There you go. There you go.
There we go. There it is. It says in 2:16, therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by a sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head. Wow. So Jesus, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together, through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. And then he goes on to say more things about do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And it talks about how these things have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh.
That's essentially what we're dealing with here in Mark 7.
Yeah.
Is that we want these external things to produce some internal change, and what we're going to find is that they don't.
So you talked about legalism versus antinomianism this weekend. Can you say a little bit more? Like, I know you explained what antinomianism is.
Yeah. So, and we could do a better job of talking about that, sure, because I didn't have much time this weekend to really get into it. But antinomianism is a thing. And it's probably more common than what most people listening may realize, because there are well-known preachers that openly, this is their shtick, is grace. And you would know them by that word. It would be grace preachers. People, and it's not that I am not for grace. It's that their vision of grace is this kind of all-encompassing. So again, that's what I was saying, this sort of immature take. It's kind of this, that the New Testament is against the Old Testament, right? So that we're in this kind of new age where grace just dominates all, and all law and commandment and expectation comes from the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. That was another time. We're not under that. We're not under law. You hear these people say a lot. We're not under law. We're under grace. And so basically what they want is, or what they preach is a Christianity that is freed from any expectation of commandment keeping, law, or even sin, issues of sin, so forth. So we're not going to really talk much about behavior. We're not even going to worry too much about sin that's happening. We're just going to talk about how much we're under grace, that we're a child of God. We want to just focus on the new and the love and the grace that's been extended, and we're not going to get into. So essentially what it is it's kind of, and Paul does address this, literally he talks about like basically that grace would ever be used as an excuse to sin.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happens. That's what happens in these folks is we really don't want to talk anything about sin. What we really want to focus on is grace and kind of to the exclusion of law. And so it's an error of emphasis. That's the trouble with it, which a lot of errors are. They usually have enough truth in them to be credible, but they just emphasize one thing over against another more than they should. And that's kind of what antinomianism is.
Okay. I was looking for the passage in Galatians that says don't use grace as or the freedom that we have or the liberty that we have in Christ to just do whatever you want. He says, use that freedom actually to serve one another, which sounds crazy. Most of us don't think of the freedom that Christ has given to us being an opportunity to serve another person, that freedom is primarily supposed to serve us.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's how antinomianism ends up with communities and in people. Is it's essentially a hey, don't judge me kind of theology. Hey, you don't get to judge what I'm under grace. I'm not receiving or accepting any of your judgments about me. And so what we're doing is we're kind of getting in a spot where it's like I don't have to. I want to be with a people and around people that are telling me that I'm okay, that things are good, that I'm under grace, and where nobody's going to judge each other or call us out on sin or any of that kind of thing. And it's too bad because, the New Testament does both. It talks about grace, but also in the same letter, like to the Ephesians, but Paul does this multiple times. They'll start off talking about the riches of grace poured out in Christ, and then he ends in Ephesians with all of this, don't put away malice and slander and backbiting and let the thief stop stealing and all of this. And don't be angry and all this kind of thing is he gets into specifically how stuff you're not going to do, things that need to be avoided. And Jesus himself said in John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So we often miss that Jesus had his own, Jesus put forward commandments and asked his followers, asks us. I would not put that in the past tense. That's current. We're called to keep those things and take them seriously. So there's a balance to this. I think you could call it even grace and truth if you wanted to look at it like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how when Jesus says that, if you love me, keep my commandments, he is the only one who is qualified to call on the love of the person who is who their affection is towards him. Because he is God, he is saying, if you love me, obey me. And obedience necessarily flows from our love for him. I wanted to talk a little bit about legalism too, because we talked about antinomianism, but I want to talk about legalism. And I think that legalism is interesting because really when we've talked about it already in this podcast, but when you define it, it really is like a moralism, or it just provides this appearance of a moral life apart from asking for God's help to accomplish it.
Yeah, so it really is behavior devoid of grace. So it's right behavior, but for wrong reasons. So if you think about what you just said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Another way you could think about that is that worship shows up, that obedience is worship. So when I obey, I'm worshiping. It's more than just singing songs in church, but my obedience is represented as worship because it's love for God. So what you have with legalism is obedience separated or disconnected from love. And that's because it really has no need or room for grace. So if you're really thinking of it, what happens in legalism is sort of this idea that if I obey, I get a reward. And it puts me in the driver's seat. What you're going to notice is with both of these that we're talking about, is both about you get to remain in control. You're in charge of your life. And so that's kind of what's happening here. So the verse that I brought out this weekend is from Psalm 19, which is it's a psalm where David talks about God's glory revealed in creation, but then he gets even more detailed in talking about how God's goodness is revealed in and through his word. And so it's kind of like Psalm 119. They're similar to each other. But in Psalm 19, in fact, let me just open it and read it. He writes this. He says, the rules of the Lord are true. This is verse 9. And righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey. So we're talking about the drippings of the honeycomb. So we're talking about, think about this, like statutes, rules, ways, commandments. Do this, don't do that. Things that you could be obedient to. Honor your father and mother. Keep the Sabbath. Do not commit adultery. Love your neighbor as yourself. These are all commandments that could be kept. And David is saying these are more to be desired than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. And then this phrase really stood out to me. I was teaching this to the men at Brotherhood Breakfast a couple of weeks ago, and this really stood out. In keeping them, there is great reward. And what I was thinking about is there's a difference between in keeping them and for keeping them. So I talked a little bit about this weekend. We have a new puppy at home. Our dog, Pat, passed away, if you didn't know. Heather posted about it. We didn't announce it to the world too much, but it was on one of her stories. Anyways, he died while we were out of town a few weeks ago. Really sad deal. We think he got attacked by another dog in the neighborhood and didn't recover. Yeah. So Pat's gone, our little buddy. And so we decided to get a new puppy. So we went to pick him up in the last, Friday. And so he's a mini Aussie or a mini American Shepherd. They have a lot more energy. I'm super excited about him, but I'm like, okay, we've got to have to train this dog so that, he doesn't just destroy our home and run wild. And so I bought this course from this guy in the UK who does puppy training, and it's really good stuff. I was amazed at how much of it, so it's bound to work its way into a sermon at some point, because I was like, wow, there's a lot about this that relates to our relationship with the Lord. But one of the things he said that I thought was fascinating is that dogs, you think about it, dogs don't understand words. They attach words to outcomes. And so they don't even know their own names, as you and I understand that our name is who we are, a representation of our identity or whatever. But but a dog just understands that when we say a certain word, it gets their attention. And so what they do is you learn to attach commands to rewards to commands. So they don't understand the heart of the command. They just know that when I do the command, I get a reward. So I was teaching my little puppy just yesterday to sit. And you can say the word sit. We've probably all done it, sit. But if you stop and just use your head for a second, the dog doesn't understand English. You could be saying stand. You could be saying fly. He doesn't know. He just knows what you're learning, what you're teaching them is that this sound gets attached to this action. So what I do is I just had this little dog treat in my hand, and I just sat there and held it above him. And initially he's like, trying to grab it and jumping up and all of this. And I just sit there and wait. And as soon as his butt hits the floor, when he finally just like, okay, that's not working. When his butt hits the floor, bam, I give him the treat. And I keep doing that. Eventually I start attaching the word sit to it. And now he's starting to understand, when I do this, I get a reward. Now, here's the key. I'm telling this for a reason. That's a reward for doing something. And what that means is that he doesn't even have to know why he's doing it. He doesn't even have to understand the command. His heart doesn't even have to be in it. All he wants is the treat, is the reward. And when you think of it that way, you can easily detach action from motive. Motives could be selfish, but behaviors could be desirable, if you will. That's exactly what's going on with these religious leaders. The reward that they're after is a selfishly motivated reward. They're going through the motions of these religious behaviors because they want maybe whatever status it gets them in their community. You might say, really? How do you know that's true? Well, I can point it to you. In Matthew 6, or let's say Matthew 5:20, Jesus says, unless your righteousness, he's speaking to the masses. He says, unless your righteousness, your good deeds, your good behavior, your record of right, unless it surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. What a statement. What is he saying? Is he saying you're going to have to be more moral than them? You're going to have to be more religiously observant than them. If they're washing their hands before every meal, you're going to have to go even further than that. That's not what he's saying.
Right.
He's saying they're giving lip service. They're going through the motions of religious behavior, but their heart isn't really in it. That's exactly the critique that he levels against them here in this passage. He says, well did Isaiah speak of you hypocrites. That's a key word. When he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And I think it's so fascinating that Isaiah says, in vain do they worship me. In other words, all of their religious observance, their giving, their generosity, their tithing, their temple sacrifice, their whatever it is, their ritual washing is vain. It has no effect. It produces nothing in them. There's no reward for doing it. That's because the reward is not for the behavior, it's in it. And what the difference is that when I understand a command, when I understand what God is asking of me, when I'm doing God's statutes, let's say from the heart, not just out of a desire to please him, yes, but a desire to become like him, then in the doing of the command, there is a benefit. There's a benefit in becoming more patient. There's a benefit in self-control. There's a benefit in generosity, in that I take on more of God's character. What's fascinating about that is if you detach the heart from it and it remains selfishly motivated, then what you have is a religious person who does good things but doesn't have the character of Christ. So I'm talking about this weekend. If you've ever run into a Christian or someone who purports themselves to be a Christian, but is nothing, they're very moral, but they're nothing like Christ, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. They have not received the reward in doing the commandment. They've done the commandment for the reward. And it's a way to get God in your debt. Because I can imagine a puppy doing this or a dog doing this, is that I will produce a behavior for you. Where's my treat? And when God doesn't give it to you, then what you see is the story of the parable of the prodigal son and the older brother. He's angry. Listen, you, I've done all this work, and never once have you thrown a party for me and my friends. He's indignant because I've performed and I haven't gotten what I deserve. And that's because the work, the action is separated from the motive. Mm-hmm. That's what hypocrisy is in Jesus' kind of day. Hypocrisy is not saying one thing and doing another. It's going through the motions of something but not doing it from the heart. And I think it's super easy for particularly people, I would say, this is me, maybe it's you too, who were raised as Christians from the very beginning to fall into this, because we don't have that I was lost, now I'm found story. So we end up feeling like we're better than other people because we've never done any of the stuff that other people have done. Or we end up feeling, this was me, very little love for God because I couldn't see how I was much of a sinner who needed saving because I had just always been a Christian. I never sort of came to faith in that way. And so I think it's easy to fall in that trap.
So I think you said something this weekend about external behavior and internal motivation being different, and that if you do that, what you're doing is like the commandment of God basically is of no benefit to you.
Yeah.
So that's that Psalm 19 idea.
Interesting. Yeah. It is, and it's in the Sermon on the Mount as well, where Jesus says, when you fast, don't fast like the Pharisees when they disfigure their faces and they go around moping to everybody. Oh, what's going on? Oh, I'm fasting right now. Oh, wow, you must be so spiritual. He says, truly, I tell you, they have received a reward. Now, I think this is happening like culturally. I think it's happening within and without Christianity. What do I mean? I think we are masters at putting our best selves forward on social media and in other ways to elicit compliments from other people so that we can be seen to be good. So let's take an example. Two people are giving. They're giving to a charity or they're giving to a church. One is doing it because they're motivated by compassion, not just compassion for the people who, yes, compassion for the people that they would be giving toward, or the charity that they're giving toward, but also out of gratitude and reflection upon what God has done for them. They don't want to be seen. It's not about notoriety. Goodness, what do I have? I'll tell you. I'll give you a great case in point of this. I've been reading at the beginning of this year, and I'm a slow reader, but this biography of Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a minister in Wales and England last century. And he was a medical doctor, and a really brilliant medical doctor as a young man. And he left his career in medicine and goes into the ministry, begins preaching. And God used him in a powerful way. There's this quote at the beginning of the book that is so arresting to me, because you can imagine he gave up being a doctor that would have put him in. He served under the king's physician, so he was positioned to be somebody, a who's who in kind of the medical field of that time, of his day. And he leaves all of that to go to a no-name place in Wales to be a pastor for something like 10 years there, and then he takes another pastorate in Westminster. But anyway, yeah, and I mean, meager salary, all this kind of thing. And so you could imagine that people were blown away that he would leave the medical field and all the trappings and the financial opportunity that comes along with that to take what seems to be a kind of dead-end job. But there's this quote. He says, "I gave up nothing. I received everything." And it's hit me so much to think about, this is not a sacrifice what I'm doing. What God's called me, are there hard days? Sure. But let's be real. What Christ has done for me, what I'm doing in response, pales in comparison. Mm-hmm. I want no credit. I need no credit. I want that should be our posture. So imagine someone giving from that place, and then someone who's also giving, and perhaps even giving more, but their motive is, I know people are going to see this. I know that it's going to build my reputation in some way. They're going to put up a plaque. Mm-hmm. My name will be on the building. You could totally see same action, mm-hmm. completely different motives. And that's why Jesus says, whatever reward you get from people looking at you and going, "Oh, wow, you're somebody," enjoy it, because that's mm-hmm. all you're going to get from that action. But for this person, there is a reward in the keeping of the commandment, in the obedience to the Lord. I guess I'd ask you, which type of person would you rather hang out with? Which type of person would you rather have as a friend? Which type of person would you rather have as a father or a mother or a boss? I mean, it's no contest. I would much rather have the mm-hmm. one who is operating from this place of humility and gratitude for what the Lord has done for them. And so their good works, you could say, their love for people, their compassion towards others, is all motivated by this fountain of generosity and love and grace that's been poured out on them. That would be a far better person to be around than a person who is trying to build their reputation, their mm-hmm. status, their following. Yeah, I mean, it's just a whole different motive.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to talk about we've pretty well covered the first half of this, and I want to talk about the second half, because you kind of turn this diamond a little bit and see something different in the conversation I believe that Jesus is just having.
Yeah, so it's kind of with the crowd. So initially he says, "Hey, everybody, listen."
Yeah.
So he says to everyone, "Look, what defiles a person is not what comes to them from the outside, but rather what's on the inside of them." And then the crowd dissipates, and now he's in a house with just his disciples, and they're like, "Hey, explain this to us." He's like, "How do you not understand this? Don't you see that what comes into a person can't defile them, since it enters not the heart but the stomach, and then is expelled?" And it says, Mark says, "Thus he declared all foods clean. That's an important statement. Jesus, again, this is what I was talking about at the very beginning. This is not like we got to get rid of all that old ritual purity stuff, but rather what he's saying is, I am fulfilling, and I am going to fulfill all that pointed to. That's what I'm going to do. And so now, so he says, for from within come all these evil thoughts, slander, envy, greed, jealousy, whatever it is. I don't have the list memorized. Sexual impurity, adultery, all of it comes from within a person, and that's what defiles them. So his point is that what's broken about humanity is not that outside or external forces, situations have been imposed upon us, thus ruining our state of purity, but rather that we are impure at the heart level, which is really runs cross-grain to kind of the way we think about ourselves and sort of this our kind of modern world.
I remember one time when my husband and I were youth pastors years ago, we were talking about the concept of original sin with a teenager. And we said, you're born with sin. And she goes, no, I wasn't. Like, she just looked totally shocked at the idea that she wasn't just good. It does correlate with what you said this weekend. So do you want to unpack that a little bit? Well, one of the ways to avoid Jesus is to avoid sinful behavior.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the idea is that if I'm really good, then I have no need for a savior. And that's why I think religion is so hard to see in the mirror, is that because I'm good, I'm never really confronted with my own brokenness. I said this weekend, but I run into people who tell me they have a lust problem, or that their marriage is broken, or that they've cheated, or that they've got a consumerism problem or whatever. But I never run into anybody that says, I'm religious. It's because it's impossible to see. It's not impossible. It's very hard to see in the mirror. And very few religious people are ever really converted because they've built a life trusting in their own works, behavior, moral record. Their whole identity depends on, I'm one of the good people. I'm doing it right, and they're wrong. And that's really hard to come to the end of and repent of.
And essentially, when you get underneath it, what they're dealing with is guilt and shame in their own power. So another thing that a good way to kind of delineate between the effects of guilt and the effects of shame is, guilt is, I know that I am guilty and deserving of judgment. And the tendency that we have most of the time when we're experiencing guilt is to run away and hide. And shame is kind of the outcome, the emotional outcome of guilt. It's the sense of feeling like I'm not enough. And so what we tend to do, rather than running away and hiding, we tend to cover with other things. And so that's what you're describing is this, I'm going to cover my shame with religious behavior, or I'm going to cover my shame with, if you wanted to make it achievement and success, it could be that, or how many followers I have on Instagram or social media, or whatever. So that's essentially what I think the Pharisees are doing in many ways, is they're hiding their shame, their guilt and shame, with this religious kind of veneer. And Jesus is like, you can't do that because your problem.
External behavior is not enough to deal with the internal problem.
Yeah.
You've had something you want to say.
This week when I was reading Mark 7, I was filled, like in the first half, with so much fear.
Really?
Because I was reading it and I was just like, oh my gosh. First of all, if the Pharisees can't make themselves clean, they can't remove whatever it is, how could I ever hope to? And then it goes on and Jesus speaks to the crowd, and then he goes, if anyone has ears, let him hear. And then the disciples are like, we have no idea what you're talking about. Can you please explain? And so I'm like, if these guys who are right in front of Jesus couldn't hear, how could I ever, if they couldn't understand, how could I ever hope to understand? And then I read the rest of 7 and I was like, guess I'm going to just sit with that. And for like 3 hours, I was just like thinking about this of like, what is going on here? And it just like finally hit me, like the miracles at the end are really the like such a cool thing about Jesus. So at the end, there's a Syrophoenician woman and then there's the deaf man. And what comes out of the deaf man, there's an impediment to his speech and he can't hear. And Jesus puts his fingers in his ears and spits in his mouth.
Well, yes, yeah.
Touches his tongue in some way. And he can hear. And, well, Jesus says, let them be opened. And then he can hear, and then he can speak without an impediment. So if what comes out of me is defiled, there's an impediment of what comes out of me. There's something in a problem of how I can hear. And I'm like, whoa. So I'm reading this and going, who could ever hope to understand the one who goes to Jesus and says, put your fingers in my ears, let them be opened? How could what I say ever not be defiled or have an impediment?
That's really good,
The
Lindsay.
one who places,
who
allows Jesus to place.
I could have preached that. That's
And
great.
the Syrophoenician woman, this like wrecked me so hard because I think the unclean spirit was like specific to this story. For her to come to Jesus, she's a Gentile.
Yep.
So there's no food sacrifice or lamb sacrifice that is going to make it to where her daughter could be clean. And she says to Jesus, I don't even know if she like makes this connection, but she says to Jesus, like, can I eat it? Bless my daughter. Remove the unclean spirit from her. And he's like, you can't cut the dogs, do I feed the...
It's not right for the master to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs.
Yes. And she says, but even the dogs can eat the crumbs and of the bread. And like, I don't know if she's like, I'm sorry. I know
Go. This is good.
I don't know if she even knows, but that he is the bread of life and his body will be broken and she will eat the crumbs of it. And she will have the crumbs of that blessing.
Wow.
And she says that. I don't know if she can comprehend, but what comes out of her is this faith, like, no, I will eat of that blessing. And my daughter will be made clean.
Yeah.
No, you are the food sacrifice. You are the thing that makes me clean. And then he casts the spirit out of the daughter. And so it's, who can make me clean?
That's so good, Lindsay.
Who can open my ears? Like, where is the hope that I could understand? Or it's him.
It's in him.
So put your fingers in my ears and let them be open.
Wow. I was talking about the dog training stuff earlier, and one of the things as I'm listening to this, the kind of line that I wrote down was from this guy. He said, basically what you're trying to get your dog to do or to understand is that in whatever situation in life they may come to, whatever they may face in terms of anxiety, scary situations, stuff they don't get, what you want them to do as their master is for them to sit, to look at you for guidance and direction, and you'll take care of them. And I thought that is it. Like that's my posture to the Lord. I just, whatever life may throw at me, I'm to look here for guidance and direction, trusting that it'll be good. And I think that's why Jesus is so blown away. We didn't get into it this weekend, but by the Syrophoenician woman, is that she doesn't take his comment about it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. He's saying, look, there's an order to this thing here. And he came first for the people of Israel because he had a covenant with them. But she says, yeah, but even these dogs are still reliant on the master. In other words, I'm just looking at you and I'm trusting that I'm just in your care. Yeah. And I think you're good. And I think you're going to give me what I need. And I think he's blown away that she understands her relationship to him. And I think this deaf guy, same thing. Similarly, it's like the only thing that can save me here, the only one that can do anything about my situation is you. And I think that's where the Pharisees were completely wrong, is that they didn't want him. They wanted to reject him and to put him in his place and maintain control for themselves. These are people who, oddly enough, one is deaf and mute, and the other one is a Gentile and doesn't supposedly know anything about the God of Israel, and yet they both seem to get it. It's you. You're the one that's doing this. I'm at your mercy. Literally, I am a product and will be a product of your mercy because I cannot do this for myself. Long story short about the end of this sermon is that's what this is. That's what's happening here. Is what Jesus is pointing to is that you have a problem that's so deep you can't solve it. But I am going to. That's why he came. And I kind of ended by, and I got this through Tim Keller's book, Jesus the King, which is kind of a study through the Gospel of Mark. But it was so good. It was actually, I borrowed it from Keller, who got it from a guy named Ray Dillard, who kind of outlined what the high priest would have to go through on the Day of Atonement. All of this ritual washing, ritual purity, and then he talks about this prophecy in Zechariah, where Zechariah sees Joshua, the high priest, standing in the Holy of Holies, his garments covered in excrement, and this stunning picture of the high priest before a holy God looking like that. How could such a thing happen? And it's a picture of what Jesus would ultimately do, which is he would give us his righteousness and he would take upon himself our sin. And he would make atonement for it. He would offer a sacrifice that would cleanse us from our brokenness that we could never offer for ourselves. And so that's really what I think the point of this whole chapter is you're just seeing Jesus as high priest, Jesus as the one who can make you right before a holy God. And if that concept doesn't make any sense to you, I would just invite you to think about what you might do if you met the person you admired most. How would you speak? How aware would you be of your own inadequacy? Would you walk away probably from that interaction going, oh, so stupid. Why did I say that? Why did I do that? I shouldn't have, whatever. And you would be hyper aware of your appearance, of your mannerisms. You would probably apologize profusely. Imagine how much more inadequate you would feel in the presence of a holy God, the creator of the universe. That's why everybody that you see in the scripture that has any vision or encounter with God, they just immediately kind of come apart, and they're like, I'm undone, as Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 6. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in it. I mean, immediately he's made aware of his inadequacy. I was talking this weekend, I don't remember which service I got into this, maybe in the 10 or maybe the 11:30, I don't recall, but I think we've all probably had dreams, something like this, where you show up to some place that you're supposed to be, like school or work, but you're not wearing any clothes or any pants.
This is the worst.
Isn't it the worst?
Yeah, I had those all the time as a server. I would have terrible dreams as a server where I'm just serving tables, and
you're like, what have I done?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting.
Terrible.
It speaks to this feeling of deep inadequacy.
Yeah, it does.
This thing of I'm exposed and you're seeing me as I am and I don't want you to. It's not just embarrassing. It's like, it's shameful. And, I'd have dreams where early on, especially as pastor, that I was walking out on stage to preach, or it was time to go out there and I had nothing to say. Just standing there. Like I couldn't think of what I was meant to preach or what I was going to do. And I think that's a kind of similar thing. It's like you're put on, you're being measured, you're being weighed, you're being evaluated, and you're not enough. You don't have it. And I think the beautiful message of the gospel in this story is that that's true. You don't have enough, but Jesus gave you his enough, and you belong to him, and you are in him. And so the thing is like, now I'm living with this new identity. 2 Corinthians 5:21, which is how I ended. God made him to be sin, so that, him who knew no sin, to be sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in Christ. What a stunning thing to think about. That as I stand before God, I stand before him complete and pure and clean and whole because of the sacrifice of Christ. And I would just encourage you to meditate on that and to think about it and to preach it to yourself, maybe perhaps more. I was talking to a volunteer on Saturday night who, was just how easy it is to encourage other people and tell other people of their value and worth, but to not feel it for ourselves. And I said, we've talked about this before in here, but I said, I wonder how much of that is down to how often we see ourselves today. We're so self-conscious. We're constantly in videos and in pictures and putting those things forward. And how often do you see your own face as compared to people, say, 200-300 years ago, would ever even see themselves? And you see yourself so often now. There's such a consciousness of self that I think just builds on this inadequacy. I would say this too, by the way, moms, dads, anyone listening to this, for your young daughters especially, think of what social media does, even to the most beautiful of young ladies. What would it produce in them? What outcomes? I'm not saying this has no place, but the propensity toward representing yourself as a woman as beautiful and attractive and alluring constantly. No matter how beautiful they are, that can only form, that is formational. And what would that form in you? I would imagine in a young woman form either the worst cases will be pride or despair. And I think in the vast majority of the time, it's despair. I don't know that I've run into too many women that just are supremely prideful about the way they're perceived.
If they are, underneath that is a frail, insecure human being that constantly has to have another affirmation. The last one is only going to bring a salve to you for a limited amount of time, and
by the way, then we're living in this culture as well. That think of there's some quote, I can't remember who it is, but the 1,000 slow deaths that'll if you're obsessed with beauty, the 1,000 slow deaths that you die as that fades over time. And so we're running from that with surgeries and treatments. And I'm not saying, that inherently all of that is evil, but it is a desperate attempt to cling to this. I'm dealing with it. And I deal with it. I'm 48 years old. I don't have the body that I had 10, 12 years ago, even, or exercise or diet would produce a different result than it produces today. And I have to see myself constantly because of, this. And I see these clips and all this, and I'm photographed. I'm like, oh, I hate that picture. Or I hate the way I look or whatever. And it's I don't, right? I am self-conscious.
It's real.
And it's this feeling of not enoughness that somehow if I looked like Brad Pitt does at whatever age he is, which is older than me, it's all of this stuff that you feel that you're aware of. And and I just think, what if I focused myself on a different view, on what really matters? I mean, beauty is so fleeting and fades, and it's really I won't call it completely useless, but it's vanity.
Yeah. I think I would prefer to be known for the content of my character. So I'm grappling with that reality right now because I'm letting all Okay, so people who watch this podcast have commented on like when my hair changes.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. But I am currently, so just for anyone who cares, I am allowing all my gray to just like be,
I have a lot of
like it's so I've dyed my hair for, I don't know, however long. It's not fully gray, but it's coming. And so just everybody
FYI.
enjoy this awkward transition that's happening right now. But there has been the temptation to cover, like literally
To cover. Isn't that interesting?
And to not allow it to be what it is. And so
But it's interesting because this is an external washing, you could say.
Yeah.
A covering, an elimination of that which defiles me, which reveals me to be not enough. And so I cover all that up so that I can, and it's not just a delusion I'm trying to sort of put on everybody else. It's a self-delusion. I am. Look at who I still am.
like
I still
being
got
deceived.
it. Right.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah, that's 100% true. So I think we can wrap up here, but I want to speak to something, or like I want us to talk about something real quick. You may not have anything to say.
Okay.
But I was really struck by the end of this pericope, the verses 21 and 22. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, evil, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. So what do you say to somebody who is following Jesus? They have experienced that moment of like Jesus has cleansed them, he's made them clean, and they still have these things kind of popping out of their lives
As behaviors.
Yeah.
And so what would I say to them? And yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if what you're asking is sort of related back to what we've been talking about, or just like practically, how do I deal with sin?
Yeah, I think practically, how do we deal with sin? Because I think everyone would look at that list and say, well, coveting, yeah. I mean, that could probably be something that has come out of me. Does that mean that I'm defiled? So how do I reconcile that?
Like so these things are still happening. Does that mean I'm still defiled, unclean, so forth? Well, no. I mean, the scripture says that there's a new man, but then there's the flesh that still desires what it has always desired. I think the easiest way, Paul talks about put off the old man, put on the new. I think a way to think about that is what you starve and what you feed. And what you feed will grow stronger, and what you starve will grow weaker. Chances are, if some of those things are coming out of your life, there are areas where you are maybe accidentally or maybe intentionally feeding those behaviors in ways that you need to stop. And Jesus talked about cutting things off, gouging out eyes, in order to be that aggressive in dealing with sin. Your flesh has desires. I still feel those impulses and desires, but the deepest part of me wants to please God, and I have to feed that part of me more than I allow. So in other words, you cannot live on a diet of kind of, let's call it worldly fare, and expect to have a strong life in the spirit that dominates the flesh. Your flesh will dominate your spirit at that point. And so I think if those things are coming out of your life, you probably should examine what you're feeding yourself.